Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Onondaga County Syracuse Human Rights Commission's public meeting on the I-81 project. My name is Montanette Murphy, and I am the Executive Director of the Human Rights Commission for Onondaga County. Welcome again. With me today is Chief Diversity Officer for Onondaga County, Monica Williams, Human Rights Commission Chair, Rashida Caldwell, and also with us is Project Counsel for the New York Civil Liberties Union and Human Rights Commissioner and Attorney Lanessa Chaplin. Also with me today is a host of Human Rights Commissioners. I'd like to recognize Alameen Muhammad, John Rushing, Nidecia Hernandez, and I've mentioned Rashida Caldwell. At this time, I'd like to recognize any state and locally elected officials who are with us today. If you could please raise your hand or wave or have words. All right, I see Legislator Mary Kuhn. And also Dr. Peggy Chase is with us today, Legislator Chase. The purpose of today's meeting is to state the facts about the I-81 project. This is going to be a listening session for our community, or for us, I'm sorry. We are taking this opportunity, the Human Rights Commissioners, to listen to the community about their concerns with I-81. We're here to state the facts of this project. What is the project, the history of the project, and what are the facts? A few rules before we get started. We're going to ask that everyone be respectful of others. Anyone who's speaking or not speaking, we just ask that you be respectful of others. Each person will have 2 minutes, exactly 2 minutes, to comment or to make statements. If you have a question, you'll need to raise your hand, or you can put information in the chat box. You can communicate with us via chat. We will not be able to answer all the questions today, but we will have a transcript of today's public hearing, and we'll go over those questions again and follow up with individuals who have questions about the I-81 project. Also, I want to invite everyone to visit our website, the Onondaga County Human Rights Commission's website. We're at www.ongov.net/humanrights/. We invite you to that page and explore it, check it out, and be informed. So without further ado, I'm going to pass this over to Commissioner and Attorney Lanessa Chaplin.
Thank you, Montanette, and thank everyone for coming out today. My hope is to do a comprehensive presentation on the Interstate I-81 project, and then also open it up for any kind of questions you may have, or if you want to, get into like the nuts and bolts of the actual DEIS report, we can do that as well. I always tend to think that it's very important to start off with like the historical context of the interstate. Because I think if you don't do a good job at kind of framing what the issue is in historical context, then you might look at this project simply as like a construction project, and it's a lot deeper than that. So I'm going to take this moment to hopefully successfully share my screen.
Yes, you are able to share your screen.
So before we get too deep into the PowerPoint presentation, like I mentioned, I think it's really important that we really talk about this from a historical context. And this historical context, I should just point out, is not unique to Syracuse, but it does include Syracuse. There was a national wide initiative. It was called the Mass Transit Movement in the late 1950s and early 1960s, where our national federal government wanted to make sure that people could access from corner to corner of the United States via truck or vehicle. And so as a part of that initiative, what the federal government did is they paid up to 90% of construction costs, and communities such as Syracuse put in their bids to be able to build their viaducts. Unfortunately, at that time, there was a lot of mixed initiatives. And so, for example, Robert Moses, who was our New York State city planner at the time, he really thought this would be a good way to kind of rid the community of slums and rid the community of blighted neighborhoods. This just didn't happen in New York State. This actually happened nationwide. It's well documented that majority of the communities that were raised and dismantled during the mass transit movement were Black and brown communities that were redlined from previous racist practices and or considered blighted because they didn't qualify for certain equity and homeowner loans. And so I just kind of want to frame it around, this is what we're dealing when we're talking about the removal of interstate I-81 and how it actually impacts what we're here to talk about today is like civil liberties, civil rights, and our basic human rights. So this term has been coined now, 50 years later, as environmental racism. And what environmental racism essentially is I'm not going to read this to you because I know everyone can read. It's essentially the deliberate and targeted placement of either toxics or major roadways in Black and brown communities. This is a federal and state regulation, so we're really talking about either lax land use plans, for example, in communities that you'll find majority Black or brown communities, very similar to Syracuse. It's happening here. Our communities are usually zoned for residential plus light industry, and so that type of zoning sets us up to be able to have major toxins in our community, where other zoning areas would be just like strictly residential or strictly commercial use. Black and brown communities are typically residential with light industry, and that's what we have kind of coined this term environmental racism. And just to kind of give you a kind of heads up about what we're going to be talking about here, it's nothing new, and race is the most significant predictor of a person living in a contaminated area. Now, why this slide is important to point out before we get to the I-81 viaduct, because this goes across income brackets. And so there's this kind of assumption that they tend to place major toxins in communities of low income. That's simply not the case. They place these major toxins in middle class, upper class, and lower class Black communities. So that's what we're kind of talking about here with environmental racism, as to why do we have a viaduct in the middle of a residential community? How did that even come to be? Because I think in my lifetime and others, we've always lived with the highway there. So we haven't really given it much thought about how did it get there? And so really trying to describe how this got here, not only in Syracuse, but really just impacts us nationally. And I do think that it's starting to gain some momentum since the Biden administration has taken office, where they really highlighted how transportation projects had dismantled and disrupted Black communities in the 1950s and 60s. So the few things I want to highlight here, how did we get here? Well, redlining is what placed 90% of the Black population in the 15th ward. That's exactly where the viaduct sits now. And so redlining was a practice where they made sure that Black people lived in one central area in their city. For us, it was downtown Syracuse. For other cities, it may have been different. And so what happened essentially is the Homeowners Loan Corporation, they went to 236 cities across our nation, and they lined those communities. And so if you lived in a green line community, that means you were a white community, high income community. If you lived in a yellow line community, that means you were low income, middle income, white community. Red line communities were specifically held for the purpose of Black and brown communities, and it did not go by income. So income was irrelevant. So if you were a Black community, you were automatically a red line community. And why this was detrimental to the Black community and the brown communities, because if you were in a red line community, you didn't qualify for home loans, you didn't qualify for equity loans, you didn't qualify for a business loan, regardless of your income. And that's the kind of the point I like to stress there, because we have a really rich history in Syracuse. We had the first Black teacher, we had the first Black police officer, we even had the first African-American lawyer ever to be licensed in New York State working right here in Syracuse. And they lived in the 15th ward, although they could have afforded to live in any other district in our city, they just couldn't because of these practices. These practices were upheld by real estate organizations, the federal government. And basically what it said was, it wasn't even good enough to have just a white community. You had to have in your covenant, in your deeds, that you would not sell your house to a Black owner. So in order to be green lined, you had to essentially be a white community that can guarantee it would remain white. And so I think that's a really important part of the history that we need to kind of parse out when we talk about why do we even have a viaduct there? So I think a lot of people kind of assume, well, it's always been there, it's for the benefit of all, but really some folks more than others paid the price for that highway. And we talked about the mass transit movement in detail and kind of what that really entailed. And then the urban housing renewal, which we know